Keynote speakers, if you have any quick response, I can give some minutes. Blythe or Frederick?
I think one thing is important, and that comes when we have this kind of predictions, like predicting the job applicants, how qualified that person is, or things. I think predictions are not facts. They haven't happened yet. And they can actually develop in basically any direction. So I think that's really important to keep in mind, and that if one's using the systems, they should not be used as fact, but more as to guide interventions or what resources to put in.
I would love for us to open it to the audience. I think we've talked enough.
Oh, okay. I'll try to finish, say, 10 or 15 minutes from now. So we'll try to use the time to entertain questions from the audience. So if you, let me see how many have questions. Please raise your hand if you have questions. I see several already. Then in order to manage the time perhaps properly, I think better to have questions and then answers together. Yeah, so you have mic? Yeah. Could you raise your hand again? From here, from this direction toward that direction.
Thank you. Can people's thinking and opinion can be controlled by manipulating news feeds, ads, and search results by using personal information and recommendation, using machine learning and algorithm?
When you have questions, please stand up so that our helpers could identify who the person is.
All right, I'll keep that in mind. So, for example, let's say we got to random person A to believe that Harvey Dent is shot dead. So Facebook or the search engines show the news that he's shot dead, and ads and make fake messenger. Is that possible to make certain people believe that some event is real while it isn't by using machine learning related to the content recommendation, like news feeds, ads, and search results?
That's great.
So the next question. Can you stand up?
For your brilliant speech. My name is Ninja Kim. I have two questions, and I'm going to start with the specific one to the Facebook one and Noberto. Actually, you explained about a little bit of process like the ground truth and the algorithm, and about the intervention thing. There was a slide explaining that, and I want to ask about the intervention process, because as Andre suggested, I do think that raw data is kind of oxymoron, because there's nothing, I do think there's nothing like the ground truth, because all of this kind of issues do arose in the area of not just like cat and dog distinguishment, because all those issues do arise in the area of the judgment, so-called, like which is the good and which is the bad, like thing. So in that view, I don't think there's a ground truth, though I do think sometimes it's very important to build the flexibility of the AI, because it needs to be changed depending on the context of the social and whatever things. So I do have to question how, and I did understand that the intervention process was it was the process to modify those kind of things. So I was just wondering how that kind of intervention process do work, if I do understand it in the right way. And my second question is about the explainable AI, because just as Andre also suggested, I do think sometimes we do just focus at explainability is important, but it seems like it do collide with the area of discretion in many private areas, because there is a thing called law. We do obligate to everyone and a view of the fairness, but beyond that, it's the area of the discretion, we do believe. So, for example, just as Gary suggested, for example, in the employment process, unless we do abide by the law, actually it's quite the discretion of the private areas whether we do pick or not, and we don't have the obligation to explain all those processes. But so I do have the kind of fundamental question, because why do we have to explain all those process? Why do we have to? Which ground can we urge the AI to be explainable? To which extent? And because it can collide with the discretion thing. So that was my question. Thank you.
Thank you. And when you raise a question, if you have particular panel member that you have in mind, please make it explicit.
Hello. Well, I'm a professor from KAIST, and I have two questions. And the first one is, well, the difficulties in assessing the fairness in your algorithm. I mean, well, if you don't have the sensitive data, then you cannot assess whether your algorithm is fair or doing well or not. And I see there are two possible, well, problems with respect to the data subjects. Then if the company requests, I want to collect your sensitive data, then they will say, why are you collecting this? Then they would be quite upset for collecting that data. And another aspect can be the regulator's perspective. So they will require some severe restriction on collecting sensitive data. And well, I don't think regulators will be quite generous allowing collecting sensitive data just for assessing their algorithm. So I want to hear some experience in from Facebook or some other scholars' opinion. And my second question is, well, when we don't have a quite agreed concept of equality or what is equal or what is unequal, but I believe some extreme or radical form of equality is we need to ensure the outcome or result of any decision should be fair, equal. So that extreme form is a kind of affirmative action, right? We have some predetermined portion assigned to minority groups. And so I heard a phrase that we need to pursue some kind of algorithmic affirmative action. That should be better than we're trying to de-bias all the algorithms. So what I would like to hear panelists' opinion about the algorithmic affirmative action.
Yeah, next.
Yeah, mine is quite simple. I would like to raise a question to Professor Lace. Yeah, I just want to ask you, what is the basic difference between the federated learning system and centralizing data? Because, basically the federated learning system also is a system that belongs to Google somehow. So I just wonder what advantage it has over the centralizing data system. So if I miss something, some part, or if I confuse something, just enlighten me, please.
Okay, and one more question.
Thank you very much. I am preparing startup, I have a question to Google. I think the most valuable AI service is the movie character Samantha in the movie Her. Smartphone AI friends or AI lover. The movie character takes the sensitive data like video and audio. And the application of the sensitive data should be valuable and makes valuable service in the market. I think so. So your Google's edge computing is interesting to me in terms of the data privacy or data fairness. I have a question. The small edge computer like your XTPU can make the can have the performance for AI video and audio AI service in the wearable device or wearable device like the watch band or necklace or let's say.
I saw hands somewhere toward the back. Yeah, that will be the last one.
Thanks very much for giving me the opportunity to give some questions. I'd like, first of all, thanks very much for the presentation. It was very informative and thought-provoking, and I also like to congratulate the organizers. I have been to many seminars in Korea, but this one is most highly advanced and highly the e-learning experience is quite good. I've never been to an event like this. My question goes to the Mr. Roberto Andrade from Facebook. Recently, one of the methodology is introduced in Korea is the reading map, which was first developed in MIT, but it has gained popularity in Europe, and which is basically the participation of users, sometimes citizens, in the development of products or solutions in early stage of the research and development. You introduced this privacy processes, starting from the ideation and all those processes. And you also mentioned about the builders and teachers and people there. So I'm just wondering whether there is any role of whether the users actively participating in that process. If participating in it, what kinds of role they are doing, and what does it make a difference in your the product development? That's okay. Thank you.
You know, with the questions, I think we can spend one full day separately, but you know, we don't have the time. So why don't you try to each spend 1 or 2 brief minutes? And I think I'll give time to Blaise and Frederick first, and then we'll start from Norberto again. Okay?
I can try to answer several of the questions sort of in one go, hopefully. So first of all, Scarlett Johansson, her wonderful movie by Spike Jonze, I thought. It's at bottom, it's a movie about trust, and in particular, it's a romance. And what happens in the beginning of this movie is that there's a tremendous intimacy between the protagonist and the AI, and there is a pivotal scene in which you know, it's framed sort of in the terms of cheating or of a romantic drama, you know, in which it's revealed that she is actually having this intimate relationship with hundreds of other people at the same time. So, you know, that has you know, an obvious sort of sexual analog, which the movie plays with, but I think at a deeper level, it's about this fundamental issue of trust. And it's also about edge computing. Because if you imagine that this being that you're having this very intimate relationship with is physically here, and that the exposure to all of that very sensitive and personal information is something that is an intimate relationship that isn't shared, or somehow partaken in by everybody else at the same time. That is to say, personal and not just a service. Then that has a very different romantic and ontological character. And the break is when he realizes that it's not personal. So for me, that's exactly why it's so different to think about personal AIs that are that have that very intimate relationship versus being just services. The fact of that running physically on your own hardware is useful. There are other ways of doing that. Secure enclave technology, for example, exists that allows you to verifiably make sure that even if something is running somewhere else in a server, it's completely private and cannot be seen into. That's still nascent technology, but I expect to see those things become strong and verifiable in the coming few years, and commonplace probably. You raised the question about why federated learning matters if it's still using cloud, cloud in some way. Think about it as the conference that Samantha and the other AIs can go to in order to exchange skills. There's a big difference between skills and data. And I've used the metaphor of surgeons sometimes to try to explain this. You have patient-doctor confidentiality, which is very intimate. Your doctor knows about all kinds of personal things about you, and part of the deal with the doctor, part of that faith or that trust, is that they're not going to go around and talk to all of their friends at the bar about all of your embarrassing medical ailments. But they certainly, it's not the case that your doctor is somehow something that is shut in a box and never goes out into the world to learn things. Otherwise, medicine wouldn't be able to progress. And the way medicine progresses is that doctors get together at conferences and share best practices. But they do that in ways that guarantee that they're not leaking information about their relationships with their patients. And in a similar way, when you use federated learning to allow skills to be aggregated, that's a big difference from allowing the data to be aggregated. And that's the key distinction. Finally, I wanted to mention something else that relates to Samantha as well, which is sociality. One of the differences between weak and strong AI, the distinction that Indra mentioned, is that weak AI doesn't have any social awareness. And that's one of the problems with using AI to do things like hiring or criminal judgments. It's just a data processing machine. It's just a function. There are inputs and there are outputs. There's no sense of judgment. There's no sense of social appropriateness. Even trying to make a simple AI system that will know, for example, when is appropriate to bring a notification up on the phone is something that we don't know how to do today, right? I don't know how to put together the training data that says, like, is this a good moment to bring a particular text message up? You would have to be socially aware and to have discretion and judgment in order to do that, and that requires a level of social intelligence that we don't have yet in any AI system. There is no view of those kinds of things from nowhere. They're not only social, but they're fundamentally relational. And that's the big problem with fairness as well. As you mentioned, it's zero-sum in certain ways. There isn't some pronouncement from on high about what fair is, or what appropriate is, or what good judgment is. Those are things that are fundamentally political. There are political judgments that have to do with the relationships between different interests and different people. And our expectation that there is some kind of view from nowhere that an AI can come with in order to resolve such things is unwarranted. And when we do have strong AI that is actually able to make social judgments and whatnot, it's not going to somehow magically produce a view from nowhere either. It will be politically aligned as well. And that's something that at some point we're going to have to think pretty hard about. So, end of my comments. Sorry, that went a little bit longer than I wanted.
Frederick? Okay, so I will talk about the aspect of explainable AI, and in some sense this question whether there is no obligation to explain, humans don't have an obligation to always explain their behavior. And actually I would say again, it's all about trust. Take the example of an automated airline, automated pilot at an aircraft. or take the question, why do we trust the pilot on a plane? Well, because the pilot is also in that plane, and hopefully that person also wants to survive. So we trust the pilot because we believe that the pilot wants to survive as much as we want. And then the question becomes, why do the airline trust the pilot? Usually they do it through education, that you have some kind of, you have gone through pilot training, you have been certified to be a qualified pilot, therefore we trust you to make the decisions. And in a sense, I think that is what we're lacking here with these kind of AI systems. We don't know when we can trust them and when we cannot trust them. Of course, we have tested it on a few cases, but we don't really understand how they generalize, how they deal with cases that they haven't seen. Therefore, in order to gain our trust, we want them to explain themselves until we can convince ourselves that we will trust them. So my prediction there would be that in the early uses of these systems, we will require a lot of explanations to convince ourselves that the system is doing the right thing. Probably like if you have a new employee, you will probably monitor that employee more in the beginning before you can know whether you can trust this person or not, or know what are the strengths and weaknesses of this person, what are the things he or she can do on their own, and what do they need help with. And actually I think it will be the same kind of process with these automated systems. Then after a while, we will start trust them more, and then we probably won't require an explanation until something happens. Because when there is an incident, just like if there is a car accident or something and you are called to trial, then you will have to be able to explain what you did, why you did it, and so on. So in some sense we need the capability in the systems to provide the explanations, even if it's not used that often, because there are those exceptional cases where it will be actually needed. So again, I think it boils down to trust, but also that we need to be able to introspect and learn from what these systems are doing and why they're doing it. And actually, if I may make a final remark, I guess we won't have time for that. I think what's also interesting is that do we have the right level of trust? So in some senses, I think we over-trust the systems. We put too much confidence in them. Likewise, they will put too little trust in the systems. So in some sense, I think we have to find the right level of trust. It's not a binary choice, but more finding the appropriate level. And that, I think, is the key. Thank you.
Good. Yeah, no, great. So there were a number of questions, and so I'll try to be very brief. So the first one was on manipulated media and deep fakes. I think if the question is, can you use AI to produce that type of content and trick people into believing that that is real, I think, yeah, absolutely. We can see how better and better this deep fakes are becoming. I think the question is, what should we do about it? So, and I think this is a matter of shared responsibility. On the one hand, it's about developers not using this type of content for malicious purposes. So there's a question of education there, and also of raising awareness to the very negative implications that can derive from that type of content. Also, responsibility of companies, like Facebook, to work on defining what violating content is in terms of deep fakes and manipulated media, and what are the consequences of uploading it to our platform. Also, responsibility to develop AI to identify, detect that manipulated media, and I think that, and also I think academia and research institutions are working, some of them already on this topic. So there's a shared responsibility to work together in developing AI to counter and identify that type of content. And then also responsibility of legislators to understand to what extent this is negatively impacting society, and then what norms can be developed around this. There are some draft bills in the US around the idea of having some trust marks for manipulated media, for example. So it's a societal problem with a lot of nuances. The issue of intervention bias, and so I think first, I think that was kind of conflating the ground truth with the intervention bias. So I completely agree that the ground truth, sometimes it's relatively easier, straightforward to define, and sometimes it's really difficult. So the classic example of ground truth of what a cat is and what a dog is, you're not going to see many philosophical discussions around that. That's going to be pretty straightforward. But if you talk about false news or hateful speech, and then it's very complicated to actually have the ground truth. And it's about having guidelines and consistency and justifying how you actually label that as that type of content. The intervention bias idea is kind of the later stage. So you can have bias at the labeling stage, you have bias in terms of predictions that are made by the algorithms. But then, even if you have done a really good job with the labels, with the predictions, there's still a bias in terms of intervention, of what actions can we make based on those predictions. So I'll give you an example of training an AI system to detect false information. Here, you can train the system to be really good, but then there's also another decision you need to make that's called decision threshold. So you have an AI system that will produce a score for a given type of content from 0 to 10. And then you can decide that the threshold is going to be 9, or you can decide it's going to be 8. So you need to have another decision layer there to understand how do you actually define what is false information to that extent. So if we apply the same decision threshold for all different types of content, irrespective of where they're from, you can have decisions that will impact given subgroups more than others, because you cannot expect that all different subgroups will have the same level of misinformation of uploading to our platform. So the principle of fairness here would be that yes, we would punish one group more than the other, because we are holding the same standard for the content, irrespective from where it comes from. But you can have a different decision. So that's where intervention bias comes about. The other question that I had was on sensitive data. And here I think this goes back to what was discussed also in the morning of the tensions that AI can bring to privacy and to the privacy and data protection regulatory frameworks. So if you talk to some researchers and people that are building machine learning systems and are worried about fairness, they will say we need sensitive data. We need to know which race and ethnicity the people that are represented in the data set. So from a fairness perspective, this is something that people need, and if I talk to a lot of the researchers at Facebook, they will say, hey, we actually need. We do not collect that type of data. So there's a tension with privacy that makes it difficult, for very legitimate reasons, for companies to collect that data, but at the same time does not help the fairness discussion. So there needs to be a debate on how we strike a balance here between fairness and privacy to be able to protect people's privacy while at the same time ensuring that our systems are mitigating biases. The last question was on participation of users. And here there are several ways that we involve. So the slide that I showed is more on the internal review process and more focused on the policy side of things when we get feedback from influential policymakers and privacy advocates and academics. But obviously we have teams that are just devoted to getting feedback into involving users in the process of how we build products. And I'll give you a couple of examples. There are a number of surveys that we launch to understand how users are using our products, how they are perceived, and what comments or feedback they have about it. At the phase when we're actually building new products, we have a number of focus groups that we run where we actually ask all over the world to specific groups of people of how do they perceive this product, what comments do they have, what concerns do they have, what opportunities are we overlooking when building this type of product. So that's an example. Another one is that many of our products and features are not rolled globally at the same time. So we actually roll it in a specific region or in a number of countries where we want to understand and test how that product is actually being adopted so that we can still have some lessons learned before we actually roll out to the rest of the world. So that's a way of actually involving also users and understanding them understanding how they are using our products to improve them. The other thing that is important, not so participation, but control over how our products are used, are controls. So I'll give you an example for like newsfeed. You can actually have a toggle that will put newsfeed in a chronological order. if you don't want the machine learning working for your benefit in terms of personalizing it and showing what supposedly it's of more interest to you, you can have that control of actually switching off and having just a chronological order newsfeed. And it's an interesting experiment. Another example with face recognition is that we have control. So if you don't actually want to use it, you have a control that you just turn it off. So that's another way of users having control of our products. So those, I think, were the main questions that I was asked. I just have very two quick remarks of things that were mentioned. One is on the global south and the importance of getting also feedback in terms of AI ethics and governance and research from that part of the world. So one thing that I would just mention to you, Malavik, is the fact that we've launched a request for proposals on AI ethics in LATAM and in India, incentivizing academic articles and research on a specific number of topics regarding AI ethics. The last thing was on principles, and that we talked a lot. One thing that I would just mention that was not sufficiently emphasized is the importance that we are now moving from principles to practices, and we see, for example, the OECD and the European Commission very much interested in understanding how those principles that they have laid out are going to be implemented in practice. And they have started processes of piloting some tests and feedback, asking companies to actually run those guidelines and understand how operational, how do they resonate in the real world. So principles now have another advantage, which is creating this multi-stakeholder process where you have companies working with governments and regulatory authorities on refining and improving those principles, which I think is a really positive and healthy development.
So much to talk about. Jared, do you have?
Just two quick comments.
Okay.
Two quick comments and in response to the two questions. I think to the lady over there who asked about explainable AI in employment decision making, shouldn't companies have the discretion to decide, right, subject to the laws? Perhaps I would say regulatory sanctions. Yes, as a starting principle, I will agree with that, because those are the frameworks. If you breach them, you will attract formal sanctions, fine, compensation and all that. But okay, on the ethics side, I would say that apart from the trust issue, won't companies also want to know whether they're hiring the right people, for instance? Wouldn't they want to know? Because I think there are some studies that if the employees you take in are not sufficiently diversified, it may actually be not as productive as if the company is hiring the right people. So there may be some economics there too. Yeah. And also, just to add to that, the legal and the regulatory sanctions, though they may be there, but they may not, depending on the society, may not actually lead to fair outcomes. Maybe the enforcement is weak there, or the rules are not sufficiently definite or definitive. Second response to the professor from CAST concerning affirmative action, algorithmic affirmative action and debiasing. Personally, I would not put both of them together. I see a distinction. Yeah. Because for debiasing, actually I'm coming from the point of view of mitigation of bias. See whether you can mitigate bias along the stages. But for affirmative action, it's quite a loaded word, both legally and policy-wise. For instance, the question for affirmative action is how far do you go back, in order to help the disadvantaged group? That's one. What quota do you use in order to equalize, right, between the advantage and disadvantaged people? And there's always the crutch mentality. When you try to set a quota for a disadvantaged group, it doesn't mean that they will actually accept it. That's all. Thanks very much.
Rita?
One very quick closing comment was to a lot of the points about explainability. Like we want AI to be explainable, but I think we don't talk enough about, yes, now that you've explained it, what's the remedy that ensues from that? And I think the remedies look very strange for some of the kinds of harms that we're seeing. Is it restitution? Is it compensation? Is it what kind of claims can people make against these kinds of violations? And I think it would be great to see a little more attention given to the role of remedies rather than just explainability as And I think explainability is only useful as a way along the path towards getting effective remedy. So just a reminder. And I think lastly, a really provocative and interesting piece on this was something that Jonathan Zittrain wrote recently in the New Yorker, where he comes up with this idea of intellectual debt. And I think it sort of goes to this idea of what Blaise was also saying with the pornography example of, I know it when I see it. That sort of logic also adheres to medical inventions. It's like, we know it works, we don't know how. Your headache went away, the aspirin must work. We don't quite know what that process is, but we know the outcome is measurable and that it works. We don't really understand how. But over time, all of these drugs that we knew worked but didn't know how, you then started having a lot of R&D into side effects, into consequences, into interactions with other drugs. And that intellectual debt was paid off over time. You didn't know it up front when you trialed it, but it got paid off over time, and we got to know more and more about those drugs. And he posits that same kind of approach might actually be useful with AI, which is saying, you don't need to hold it back. You don't need to hold back certain technologies if they meet certain other thresholds of saying they're safe enough for use as we see it, but there is an intellectual debt that needs to be paid off. And the problem with AI might be that it's being generated so quickly at warp speed, right? We're rolling these out in really, really like in real time without doing pilots. The more responsible players are. But you don't know what a control test looks like. It's very difficult. It's not like with medical, A and B kind of things. So I think this idea of intellectual debt is also really interesting in this space.
Thank you. Ingrid?
To close, so there was one technical question. If you don't have sensitive data or can't access of sensitive data, how about ensuring fairness? Is it possible? So a brief answer would be, we absolutely have to have sensitive data in order to proactively make models fair. Sensitive data should not be used in decision making when those models are already in operation. But during the model training process, sensitive data must be there. Otherwise, it's just gambling, whether it will or will not be fair according to the definitions. Causality is the way to go, I think. Causality can save us from having to have sensitive data if it appears to be that the sensitive data is causally not relevant. And again, there is no one definition of sensitive attributes. So for instance, even say gender can be irrelevant in banking while relevant in medical, say breast cancer diagnosis. So it's, again, context dependent. The second question that I wanted to touch upon was about this fake news. So can AI be used to manipulate and make news feeds? So yes, of course, as any other technology from email spam to use scams to design of nuclear reactions, to use atomic bombs, any technology in principle can be used for good or evil. There's nothing specific, I think, about AI and fake news. It can be used in many ways. The important part is that how to detect it. We will have to rely more and more on our human contacts on each other to sort of reputation-based and trust-based recommendations from human colleagues. So we will have to rely more on AI, but we will also have to rely more on each other for fake news and in general in the world. So I think human contact will be as important as more trust in human contact as trust in AI. And the final point I wanted to make was on weak versus strong AI, the discussion that was just there. And again, Blaise mentioned that AI lacks social awareness and it's technical, it's not social. So I think it's important. And if we want to go towards strong AI, which seems to be the case, that there is a general desire for AI to sort of make also value judgments for us. So we'll have to somehow create AI culture, be it a library of concepts, some sort of memory-based global system where concepts are memorized. And what's important for that, I think, is to keep to preserve irrelevant information. And going back to an example of human child learning versus AI learning, and AI requiring many more examples to learn the same thing. So the key, one of the key aspects is that human child learns from, not from zero, but from already existing experience. So human child starts reading after already having like sort of 5, 6 years of everything else experience in the world, which may or may not be relevant. So when we build AI systems, machine learning models, we sort of filter, in a supervised learning way, we filter them out that only the relevant part is remaining. So I think if we want to create AI culture, we would need to somehow make a way for AI to keep irrelevant information, to preserve irrelevant information, and preserve it somehow selectively. I think that's the way. Maybe some semi-supervised, unsupervised way. I don't know. I have no idea how. So there.
Okay, thank you.